Well, I think that great love creates enormous space. Like, love's going to find a way to create space. And in a gracious, sacred space, there are boundless possibilities. Love trusts that something wondrous can emerge when hallowed space is created. What comes to my mind immediately when I think of great space is my experience of meeting the philosopher Jacob Needleman 2 years ago in a Seattle bookstore. When Jacob arrived in Seattle, there was a quiet atmosphere of expectancy. It wasn't like the arrival of our rock star with all the noise and clamor. And then later in the day, after his lecture, a group of us went to Seattle's Gurdjieff Society, and there it was even quieter and there was even more space. I was meeting people that day who were very comfortable with silence and with space. They trusted it. The silence was so rich and deep that I immediately felt relaxed and alert in response. I actually was sort of astonished, and that's why I'm commenting on it. In my own feeble way, I've tried to create life-giving space. And some years ago, a school administrator told me that she'd never been in a more controlled space than my Calgary Yoga Academy. And initially, when she said this, I thought that perhaps she was complaining to call my yoga studio a tightly controlled space. But I hadn't understood her. She was saying that I had created kind of like a custom-made liberating space in which human beings could find themselves and flourish. In your controlled yoga space, she said, I've never felt freer. And I thought, that's it. I tried in my own way to create a space where human beings could truly flourish. I think what had happened is she had created within herself a kind of inner spaciousness over the years that enabled her then to experience a correspondence between that and the space that was in that yoga sanctuary. She lived in a good space. However, I also can't fail to recall that that same space that gave life to some was like an alien threat to others. And some of us still have memories of people trying to get out of the room. Like there were people who would come and then they'd try to get out the door. We would lock the door after the class would begin. And sometimes people would try to get out the door and we would just help them out. We don't try to keep them in there. Okay, you need your space, on you go. Come back another time. But just amazing, eh? Like people sometimes would rather be in an atmosphere of great noise, or they would like to, I don't know, argue with each other. They like to clog up space by having arguments. In 19th century London, for example, there was a great preacher named Joseph Parker who was a contemporary of Spurgeon's. He would have been preaching in the 1860s and the 1870s primarily. Young men used to line up down the street in the hundreds to hear this man speak. In his biography, Parker recalls that when he was a child, his home was a center for noisy and loud theological arguments. I mean, there's no space here. This is clogged space, people doing battle. He called it the academic kitchen. So weekly, these men came to do battle with each other, and he calls them restless and eager disputants. For them, he says, to live was to argue, and not to argue was to die. So Parker describes his memory of the kitchen academics in this way. The subject was generally theological and raged most fiercely around the 9th chapter of Romans, especially with reference to the cold and chilling figure of the potter and the clay. Parker describes the leader of the group as a strong Calvinist, and all the stronger for knowing nothing about Calvinism, along with several Arminians who were equally ignorant. He sums these fellows up by saying that their chief concern was to prove that very few people could be saved, and that those who were not saved would wallow in fire and brimstone eternally. These men were sure, of course, that they themselves would be spared from the wrath of God. They regarded themselves as at least one kitchen full of really saved people. They were, says Parker, people who demonstrated that ignorance cannot doubt. So on and on it would go. The kitchen, the hot coffee, the emulous smokers, the fierce debaters, my sweet mother on the fringe of the assembly, heartily wishing that Calvin had never been born. For the young Joseph Parker, these battles were like a troubled dream, and he knew early on, as his mother's son, that a Calvinist he would never be. No, instead, he would become in his life and ministry an inspiring preacher who continually created enormous space for people to grow and flourish in. For example, this loving, space-creating preacher understood and taught that God is so much greater than what our minds can comprehend. Parker taught a reverential humility, awe, and wonder before the unknowable God. Quoting from the book of Job, Parker states, "God is great, and we know him not." And then went on to say, God is unknown, unknowable, yet not the less the one reality and the one energy of the universe. I am tired, Parker says, of the known and the knowable. Soul of man, if thou wouldst truly see the boundless, see the possible. See God by going into the dark when and where the darkness is thickest. That is the mighty and solemn sanctuary of vision. That is, you may be able to experience a vision of God when you stop thinking that you can see him. Let go of your mere daylight understanding and enter the revealing darkness of unknowing. The light, says Parker, is vulgar in some uses. God hideth himself oftenest in the light, which is to say that God is least known by those who are so confident about what they think they know. Theirs is what he calls a daylight understanding, an expression of vulgarity and idolatry. Why? Because the elements of surprise and mystery have been removed. Several years ago, my wife asked me to attend the Catholic Latin Mass with her in Calgary. We hadn't been to church for a long time. My immediate sense when I walked into that sanctuary was that I was entering a sacred space, which seemed to me to be such a contrast to the crowded and noisy spaces created by a lot of other churches. There was room in the Latin Mass for mystery and for wonder. And in that solemn space, that sacred space, I began to feel that I could perhaps recover and affirm a faith that I was in danger of losing entirely. Like, that's the power of sacred space. And in that context, I began to feel a sense of joy, a sense of knowing that Joseph Parker would describe as wider than knowledge. So according to Joe Parker, God is best defined when undefined. Who is God? A fire that may not be touched. Who is he? God. What is he? God. Of whom begotten? God. He is at once the question and the answer, the self-balance, the all. God, God, God. Ever hidden, ever present, ever distant, ever near. A ghost, a breath, making the knees knock in terror, ripping open a grave at the very feet of our pleasure, a mocking laugh at the feasts, filling all space like the light, yet leaving room for all his creatures. A terror, a hope undefinable, unknowable, irresistible, immeasurable. God himself is that love who creates space in which we can dwell and find our truest and clearest sense of being. So I repeat that great love creates enormous space. And entering that space, entering such a sacred space, will enable us to find our bearings, so to experience a deep grounding, and at the same time, we grow wings. We get both a grounding and we soar heavenward. If you think of your best moments, think of when you're really inspired, there's a sense of enlarged space, and it's in that space that you can dream dreams and have visions. Deep change is possible when that kind of space is created. Early in Joseph Parker's ministry, there was severe criticism, but a kind, space-creating man intervened to keep the young man from becoming fatally discouraged. In a life-changing encounter, the young Joseph Parker said to the kind man, "They say that I'm too theatrical and bombastic." Said the older man, "They are fools, my boy. You are but a boy, and your mistakes are nearly as numerous as your sentences. But I like a boy's bold mistakes, and all will be all right at last. Go on, trust in God, and try again." The kind and understanding man then asked, "Is your heart right with God, Joseph?" "You make me tremble, sir," he said in response. "Tremble, Joseph, but answer." Then the young Joseph Parker says, "Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee." And then the older man said these words to the young preacher, "All that matters, Joseph, is whether your heart is right. Give me a sound heart, and all the rest will be all right." Then Joseph said, "But I do not do good in the way that other preachers do. I'm not like them." And in response, the kind man told Joseph Parker that he was not to be like the others. He was to be himself. Talk about giving another human being space. Parker, in his despair, had felt the space closing in on him. People who lived in enclosed spaces were determined to end the young preacher's career. The older man opened up a space for Parker to be himself and to find his voice, which has been sounding powerfully ever since. My point is to say that this is what love does. Love has a way of creating a space when it seems that none is available.